Okay, so now let's talk about making a 3D print of our characters so we can have something to put on our desk. Um, there's a few different things to consider about this. The first being there are many different kinds of printers out there. Like anything, you kind of get what you pay for. There are lesser quality printers, and there are better printers out there that have different levels of resolution within them. Typically, I print my characters at 25 microns, and the machine that I tend to use has a high, medium, and low resolution. The high being 15 microns, the medium being 25 microns, and the low res being 100 microns. So, depending on what you need to do, you can adapt what parts you send to what printer or what resolution you use. So for example, if this character was about 10 inches tall, if I was concerned about face detail, I might print the head just itself or the hands at a finer resolution and maybe bigger parts at a lower resolution. The other thing we need to consider with that printing is the scale of this character. Now typically my maquettes tend to be about 10 inches tall, and that's plus or minus, it can vary within there, but about a 10-inch figure usually is about the normal size that I print. With that being said, I need to know physically how big certain parts will be, like the little antenna and various things like that. So I'll have to consider the overall size of this, and I may adjust the model to help make sure that the parts are thick enough to print and will be stable enough to do what I need them to do. For example, if I print this helmet in a clear plastic, I'm going to cut it down the middle. I might double up this bead here, this little circle that's going around, so that one half has one bead and there's a second bead for the other half, creating a good gluing surface there. The other things I need to consider would be what type of material. Typically I'll make everything out of plastic, but in this case, because the printers now can do metal, I'll print this tube in metal. I might actually just print half of it in metal to save cost. It's a little more expensive to print in metal than plastic, so I might just print half of this tube with a little connecting tab going down. The same with the leash. Instead of just printing the leash, I'll probably include the hand in that metal print. So it will be the leash with a little plug going into the neck here. I'll cut the hand off right at the wrist most likely, or a little below, and that will all be one piece of metal. And then when I glue it together, I can sand and clean up that seam. You'll never see it. In addition, the thing to think about with printing that affects cost, there are basically two factors. One is the cubic inches of material, how much material it'll take to print something, and how long it is on the machine running. Now, one of the main reasons to cut up your model is to save costs. So in this case for her, I'll probably cut the arms off, the head off, the helmet off, and maybe just cut her torso in half. The tube will be a separate piece, the dog will be a separate piece, etc. Couple reasons there again, one being that all those parts that are cut up can lay down flat on the printing bed, similar to this little disc down here. You can imagine that as this part is sitting on the print bed, if it's laying down flat, the print has to only go up as high as this. It's laying down little bits of material again and again, slicing it into virtual little slices like a loaf of bread. And you can imagine it will be faster to just print up to here as opposed to if it was turned up on its side and had to print much taller. That creates a longer build time. It has longer to run to print the part, which means it's on the machine for longer, which means it'll cost more money. So chopping up your parts into as many pieces as possible is always a good thing. And another consideration is the weight. In this case, because it's going to be suspended on this rod here, even though it's going to be metal, I probably do not want to print this as a solid part. I'll probably cut it here at the waist to create a little hole on each part to allow the material to flow out if it's a wax-based support material, or it'll create a lattice work inside that'll be honeycombed and a lot lighter than if it were solid. Now we'll get into all this stuff later on, dealing with scale, how we're going to cut this up, but I wanted to show a couple examples of some prints that I've done. So here's a print that I did recently. This is a ZBrush model that has been printed, and You can see here that it's got quite a bit of detail. This is actually 13 inches long from the front of this tire to the back of this tire, and this was printed on my favorite printer, the ProJet 3500, and I'll show you why I like that in a minute. But this was done at 25 microns, which is the medium resolution for that machine, and this face is about maybe 3/4 of an inch tall, and you can see there's really good detail. Under extreme light, with pretty much any printer, you'll see some evidence of the little layers, the little banding that happens. For the most part, you won't see it once it's painted, or you could do a little sanding to get rid of that. You can see the high level of detail that printer does. So here's an image of the model cut up into all the different parts. I did not cut this. I gave this to my print vendor, and he charged about $500 to cut this up. Now, that's a significant savings if you do it yourself, and if you can have someone else do it and you can afford it, that's great, but it always saves money to do it yourself. But the key here is to look at how these things are cut. In this case, it's cut all along the seams of the clothing here. The arm is cut here where the glove is, and the leg where the pants meet up to it. And the other thing is that they have little keys, little holes and keys that fit in only one way, that allow this to be glued back together like a model kit. An additional reason to cut your model up is if you want to make molds of this and make multiple copies, you want to do a 3D print and make silicone molds off of that. You can imagine if I tried to make a mold of this with all these holes and undercuts, there's no way I'd be able to make a mold of this and get copies. So you do have to think in terms of what you're going to do with the part when you cut it up. If you're just going to do one print and paint it and put it on your shelf, that's great. You can leave a lot of things free, and that's what we're doing in our case with our model. But if you plan to make molds and make copies of it, you definitely need to consider all of your little undercuts and holes and things. Here's the motorcycle, and it was cut just right here at the fork. This is one part that was printed. This is one part that was printed. Now, this is where the types of machine that you use come in. Like I said, I prefer to use the ProJet 3500. It's a really amazing machine. Not only does it have that high, medium, and low resolution, but the support material that holds up the plastic part is a wax that can be melted away. Typically, most printers, whether they're laser cured resin or it's a liquid resin that's deposited onto a bed, have plastic supports like a little lattice work or a bridge work, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. But as you can see here, there's all these little cables and pulleys and connectors that if I had a plastic lattice work inside here, simply by breaking off those little pieces of support, I would break all these little delicate parts. So that's why I prefer the ProJet 3500. It's really awesome that way. So this is what the ProJet looks like. This just got this off the web. It's like a refrigerator sized thing. Very cool machine. I believe it's in the $90,000 range, so I'm not about to buy one anytime soon. There's a lot of cool little printers that are out there, MakerBot and Formlabs and all that kind of thing. The one I might buy in the near future would be the Formlabs. It's got a 25 micron resolution. It's really nice. But for now, I send my stuff out to a service bureau, either Shapeways or my friend Dave Cortez, who does a great job as well. Now, this is what I was talking about with the wax support system. The blue is the actual part. These are rings. And you can see that as it's starting to build the material, wherever there's going to be an overhang, you need to have something that builds up along with it, so a support system. In this case, on the ProJet, this white material is a wax-based material, so that when the parts are finished, you put this whole tray in an oven, and all this wax melts away, leaving only the part. You don't have to snap off any supports. So for example, on most traditional printers, you can see here the more opaque color is the part, and this lattice work are all the little supports that need to build up to hold it in place while it's building. All this material is the same material as the part, and this needs to be snapped off, broken away. So you can imagine when you're trying to break all these little parts off, if it's a very solid piece like this, no problem, you do a little sanding, everything's good. But if you have very delicate, thin parts and this is holding it up, it's just going to break your model along with the snapping off of these parts. So here is a Lucy and Gru maquette I did in ZBrush. And I had my friend cut this up into many parts. You can see there's the torso, the head, and the collar, the pants. They all key in together. Now in this case, I had very delicate little hairs on this head. So what I was going to do in this case was mold all of these parts except for the heads. These were all directly from the printer, and I was going to make 4 copies of this model and just glue these heads on. I ended up changing how I did that a little bit later, and you'll see here in a close-up. But here you can see just different things. I'm using sandpaper and files, and I'm using a gray primer so I can see the part. Typically they're either a clear resin or a blue material. They're all different, but you want to spray it with a nice primer. I like Bondo brand primer. And you can go onto my Vimeo page, just do a Google search for Michael Defeo Vimeo, and there's a video in there of me sanding and cleaning a part, and you'll get some more detail on that if you want. But typically they come in a different color, and it's hard to see the surface until you spray it. Here you can see these legs are being sanded clean to make sure all those little build lines are gone. Certain areas that are smooth and don't have texture on them are very easy to sand if you can get to them and make the parts detachable as much as possible. You can see this part's cut up into many pieces. Just folding up little pieces of sandpaper to get in there wherever you can. Just more detail of sanding and cleaning. Sometimes you get a little ridge from when the part is printed. This was printed on a different machine, not the ProJet, so it was not the wax-based support. It had the little lattice work. So when you break off all that lattice material, sometimes when it shifts from where the lattice is to where it's the top of the part and it's not connected to that lattice work, you get a little bit of a line, a sort of a texture change. So that's what this is, just sanding and cleaning all of that. So here you can see all the many parts. Now if you look closely, you can see those little flyaways that we've been doing. In this case, they're sticking way off the surface. If I tried to make a silicone mold of this, the rubber would go down inside. You'd never get it out. So I was working on this and tried to clean them, and it was also becoming very difficult to sand up here on the forehead. I had a lot of trouble with that, so I decided to kind of consolidate all this and change it a little bit. So here you can see I've taken the bangs off so that I had access to the forehead for sanding and cleaning. The other thing I did was all those little flyaways kind of got filled in underneath. Really what I did was just duplicate them and drop them down so that it filled the gap. But I still have the same design and did the same here. And then this part was molded, this part was molded, and then that was snapped on as the bangs and little sideburns. And here you can see just some of the parts after they've been cast. Sorry for the blurry picture here. Now one thing to note with this guy, Gru, is a big fella. This was not only printed solid, but it was also cast solid. You can use different foam materials, resins that are lighter, etc. If I were to go back and do this again, I would cut this in half. I would make a front and back half. So here you can see his torso is just one part. I would probably slice it right down the center and create a front and back half shell to make that extremely light. I can, in this case, just core out the bottom, and if I'm using the ProJet 3500, the wax will melt out. Or if I'm using the other types of printers and I core it out, you're going to get this honeycomb inside that you don't necessarily need to get out, but you can imagine how much lighter this will be than a solid thing. So think about that if your model's very heavy, and that's what we're going to do with our gal. We're going to core it out. So if it's like this and it has wax inside, there'll be a hole and all that wax can drain out. Or if it's done on a printer that doesn't have that wax, it'll have this honeycomb inside and it'll be much lighter than if it were solid.